What is up YouTube, I'm Royal and today I'm bringing you the patch 4.4c tier list. Not a lot of changes this patch, however there were some champions that were massively buffed. As you can already see in my mid lane tier list, and that includes Yone. So let's get straight into it. And like I said, in the mid lane tier list are god tier champions. We have Jace and Vladimir as same as last patch, but now we have added Yone and Yasuo. Yasuo was already extremely strong last patch, he was S tier. However, the buffs to his core item of Charge Blade actually are gonna push him into God tier. Yone received some really big buffs, which was surprising. The extra armor is gonna help him early against those auto attacks that mages like to do. It's gonna help him into his bad matchups like Zed, like Yasuo, like Jace. So those are some great buffs for mid lane Yone, and the extra damage you will be getting from his second ability and the extra shield and survivability have just definitely pushed him into God tier. I would even say that Yone and Jace are kind of in a tier of their own, and Yasuo and Vlad are in a tier right below that, but obviously still better than the S tier champions. So for the S tier champions, these are all the good mid lane champions. You cannot go wrong with any of them. All of these champions have their strengths, weaknesses, and they're definitely great picks right now. And mid lane is in a great spot where you actually have a lot of impact. The A tier champions just below that are more niche. They do have their strengths, they have a lot more weaknesses, and they're easier to abuse. You can pick them into every comp. The B tier champions are just kind of weaker. Not much to say about that. C tier champions are just a lot weaker, and I included Sona in the mid lane because I know that some of you will go and pick Sona mid after the rework, but please don't do it. I would have put her in F tier if I had an F tier. I just included her here because I knew that someone is gonna pick her. So for ADCs, so obviously we have Ezreal, who was the God tier last champion, but now we have Varus actually joining him in God tier. So Varus was already strong, and the extra buffs to his first ability damage make his lethality build even stronger. So now you still have the option of going AP Varus, you have the option of going just normal crit Varus, but his lethality build, which I personally think is his strongest build, just got buffed, and that's definitely gonna push him into God tier. So get Manamune and the lethality items, and you can just destroy with lethality Varus this patch. Make sure that you're constantly using your first ability to poke, and you're of course a teamfight god with your ultimate. In the S tier, we of course have the hyper carry ADCs, Caitlyn, Tristana, Kai'Sa, and Xayah. Ziggs is also in here because he's a great AP choice. In A tier, I think I had slightly underrated Sivir on my last tier list. I had her in A tier. She did receive a few nerfs to her ultimates, which I think is one of the most broken abilities in the game when used well. However, in solo queue, people don't really use it properly because people just don't group and teamfight properly. So she's still going to remain in A tier after the nerfs. All the A tier champions are fine to pick as well. The B tier champions are okay, but I wouldn't recommend them. And I wouldn't pick the C or D tier champions, who are mostly mages or not real ADCs like Akshan and Senna. Ezreal and Varus will continue to dominate, like I said. So let's move on to the jungle, where Lee Sin will remain as the God tier champion until further notice. I don't think I'm going to be removing Lee Sin anytime soon unless he receives nerfs or some other champions receive buffs and they can join him in God tier. Kha'Zix is the only champion that, like I said in my last tier list, is hovering between God tier and S tier. I could include him next to Lee Sin and I wouldn't have a problem with that. However, Lee Sin is just on a tier of his own. Aatrox has actually been pretty good, Riven since the buffs. Yone has actually joined the S tier, even though his jungle clear did receive a small nerf. His first ability now does less damage to jungle monsters. I don't think that will matter, and that the buffs he actually got will override those nerfs and even make him stronger in the jungle than before. I still would recommend him in the mid lane instead, but he's a great option in the jungle too. Master Yi has actually joined the A tier. I think Master Yi definitely fills a good niche. If the enemies don't pick a team comp with a lot of CC, he can be a God tier champion. He can take over games, especially if you have like an enchanter in your team, like Lulu or Karma to shield you and speed you up. Xin Zhao is actually a pick that I was debating putting in S tier because he received some very nice buffs. However, all the champions in A tier are still great junglers. The difference between S tier and A tier is not very big. All the A tier plus junglers are really good. And the B tier, we just have the leftover junglers that are just not that great. You can definitely play them and carry with them and fill a niche, but they're just not that great. And I would honestly avoid the C and D tier champions. I know a lot of you have been saying Shyvana deserves to be higher, but I honestly don't think so. She's a farming jungler that requires a lot of resources. But if you were gonna pick a farming jungler that requires a lot of resources, there's way better picks in higher tiers, like Kayn, for example. Why would you ever pick Shyvana when you can pick Kayn, where they have similar playstyles but can also be way more effective? So that's the main reason I have her in C tier. Like, sure, she's similar strength of champions in B tier, but there's just other champions that fulfill her niche and are better, like Hecarim, for example. So let's move on to the supports, where we have Karma in the God tier, and now she's joined by Nautilus, who got some small buffs. Honestly, unneeded buffs, definitely, because she was already God tier. But I was already debating putting him into God tier, and I'm gonna go ahead and do that now. Both Nautilus and Karma for different reasons in God tier. Nautilus the best engaged champion, Karma the best mage support. Thresh could also potentially be in God tier, but you need to be really good with him, and he's a hard champion to play. So I usually just include him in S tier, because I just don't expect all of you to be Thresh one-trick ponies, but if you are, he could definitely be God tier too. The champions in S tier are just slightly better than those in A tier, but all the champions in A tier are also very viable. As support, I would be careful with. I think Sona actually received, I would call it a slight nerf on her overall effectiveness, but I think the constant stuns could be very good for keeping her more safe and being able to peel herself more. I would definitely not pick her versus heavy dive. So if the enemy team has a lot of engage and champions that can easily kill you, I would stay away from her. But I actually think that the rework was a somewhat success into making Sona more viable in more situations. I would probably stay away from the B, C, and D tier champions. In B tier, if you're a good Rakan, then he can probably be A or even S tier, especially when paired up with Xayah, but by himself he's just not that great, and there's just better choices for engaged champions, like the Galio, that often goes underrated, like the Thresh, like the Nautilus, like the Pyke. Moving on to the Baron lane. Again, no God tier champion for the Baron lane. I think all of these 7 champions, it was 6, I added Aatrox for this patch. All of these 7 champions, great impact, very strong, highly recommend them. I just don't think that any champion is above them, if that makes sense. Like, all 7 of these are on the same level. I'm a little biased towards Jax. I think Jax is immensely OP. However, he gets balanced out by getting countered by champions like Renekton and champions like Aatrox. So I'm not gonna include him into the God tier. In A tier, you of course have Yone, who has very hard matchups against most of the S tier champions. So that's the only reason why I don't have him in S tier. However, if you're a good Yone, and you're not facing any of these champions, I would definitely recommend him as well. Jace has some tough matchups. Vladimir, you're just AFK farming, similar to mid lane. So all the champions in A tier plus are really good. The B tier champions can definitely be played, however I wouldn't recommend them in most situations. C tier champions avoid. Kayle, I just like including Kayle in D tier in every single tier list. It's just so funny. Kayle is such a unique, useless champion. Like, if you're gonna pick a late game top laner, just pick Vladimir. He does the same thing as Kayle, but better. Okay, well, that is for the tier list. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Tell me if there's any champions that you think are way more OP than what I've included in my tier list, or way too weak and you don't know why I've put them so high. I love discussing with you guys down in the comments. Leave a like and subscribe for more Wild Rift content.